Welcome. This is Antar. I want to tell you the story tonight about the first time I went to the FILLMORE Auditorium in San Francisco to hear some bands. I was lucky enough to grow up in the San Francisco Bay Area in Northern California in the 50s and 60s. And I was an avid fan of music on AM radio, and a very big development happened in 1964 with the advent of the Beatles, and which started the British invasion. That's what they called it. They call it the British invasion. And all the bands started coming from Britain. And pretty soon, all the songs on AM radio were bands from Britain. The Beatles, the Stones, the Dave Clark Five, the Kinks, the Animals. And those were all really good bands. And those were, I would say, musically blues-based bands. Pretty good blues music, some of it. I was playing in a band myself, starting in about late 1965 or summer 65, and I was playing as a vocalist and a harmonica player. And we used to do a lot of Rolling Stones covers, and you probably know that those songs had a lot of harmonica on them. Looking back to their blues influences. I started hearing rumors around with friends and musicians and in the high school that they were starting to have shows in San Francisco. And I heard about this band called Jefferson Airplane. It's a strange name, you know. And I remember at the beach surfing, and somebody was saying they saw Jefferson Airplane, you know. And I was living on the San Francisco Peninsula, south of San Francisco by about 17 miles. And there are a lot of communities there, suburban communities. And there were a lot of rock bands, you know. After the Beatles played Shea Stadium in New York in 1964, overnight there were like thousands, maybe millions of garage bands. And everybody played covers, mostly of British songs. And if you had a lot of vocalists, you did Beatles covers, and if you only had one vocalist, you did Rolling Stones covers, and that was my situation. So someone said oh yeah, I heard Jefferson Airplane, they were great, in the city meaning San Francisco. I said, oh yeah, do they do Beatles or do they do Stones? And the guy goes, no man, you don't understand. They play original material. I went, oh really? That doesn't sound good. So that became the next phase in popular music. See, it's a little difficult to understand because nowadays popular music is mythic in the Marshall McLuhan sense. Everything is happening at once. And you can go on YouTube or whatever, and you can listen to whatever you want from whatever era. But in those days, in popular music, the main venue was AM radio, and the trends came out in a linear fashion, you know. So the Beatles and the Dave Clark Five and the Rolling Stones and then the Yardbirds and the new trends in guitar licks and everything started, you know. I remember when Santana came out, the guitarists all added a minor ninth note to their solos. That's how it was working in those days. So I heard about the shows in San Francisco. There were two old ballrooms. One of them was the FILLMORE Auditorium, and the other one was the Avalon Ballroom. And it all started with a thing called the Trips Festival in San Francisco at the Longshoremen's Hall, where I had played there once with a band at Longshoremen's Hall just before that. So this was in the middle of the LSD wave of 1965, 1966. And they had this big show called the Trips Festival there. and it involved Tripster's Ken Kesey and Grateful Dead, and there were a couple of fellows there who were watching it and digging the scene, and that would be Bill Graham, who later became a rock entrepreneur excellence, and he skips my he's left my mind there for a minute. The fellow from the Family Dog, the Avalon Barnum, Chet Helms. And I started hearing about the bands. You know, there was Big Brother and the Holding Company, and Grateful Dead, and Jefferson Airplane, and that became the next thing, the next big trend in popular music, the San Francisco sound and the psychedelic music. And it was an outgrowth of folk rock. The Byrds was a band from Los Angeles who had become very popular after the Beatles. The Beatles spawned a bunch of responses from American bands that grew their hair like the Beatles, and in the case of the Byrds, they had instruments like the Beatles, and they started playing music back at them. But the members of the Byrds were originally folk musicians, and they were gigging in Greenwich Village, New York, and in Boulder, Colorado, at coffee houses. And when they heard the Beatles, they heard some kind of a resonance with their folk music. So I heard about these bands in San Francisco. There was a San Francisco scene. There was the so-called Summer of Love. People say it was 1969. It was not 1969. It was 1967. And they call it the Summer of Love because, millions of people came from all over the United States into the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. And most of them came for the party. And the people who are authentic, who are living in the Haight-Ashbury, they all moved to Marin County, Lagunitas. So I kept hearing about this. I had become a fan of the Yardbirds, which, if you're looking at it in a linear fashion, they were kind of the next blues development from the Rolling Stones. And I was really into them, and Jeff Beck was a big guitar hero. We were used to listening to George Harrison, and we were used to listening to Keith Richards, and Jeff Beck was a whole other can of worms. It was more advanced, more improvisational. Improvisation became more part of the texture. So I remember I had a friend in high school, and he was growing his hair, and he used to wear striped bell-bottoms pants. And he told me he'd been up to the city a couple of times and heard that stuff. He says, "Oh yeah, it's really great. It's like long jams, and they have long guitar solos like the Yardbirds, And then in late 65, early 66, the next trend came down the pike in the linear progression that was the 60s. And that was the Paul Butterfield Blues Band. And I bought that record, and I inhaled that record every day for months and months and years. A great record, and it had harmonica virtuoso and vocalist Paul Butterfield, and the next guitar hero, Mike Bloomfield. It was fantastic. And Elvin Bishop was in that band, and Mark Knapflin was in that band. And so I was listening to that record. And so, as I've been saying, I kept hearing about these shows in San Francisco. So one night I got together with a friend. I used to be a surfer, a North Coast surfer in Pacifica, California. And so I went to the Fillmore with a surfing friend of mine. And we went in my old car. I was 15 and a half, and I bought a car for $35. And it was a 1952 or 53 Chevy. And it ran great. And what was even better is it had a fantastic AM radio in it. And we tore the back seats out so that we could slide the surfboards to the trunk. The surfboards in 1965 and 66 were really long. They were long surfboards, 9'8", 9'6", 10. I had a 10-foot board, and you could just take the back seat out of the car and open the trunk and shove the board up through there and then close the trunk, and then you've got a surfmobile. So we went one night. We were both Peninsula boys. We were both boys who lived in the San Francisco suburbs. So we drove the 17 miles in my 52 Chevy. And I remember my friend, he hollowed out half of a filter cigarette and he filled it with marijuana and he smoked that. So we went to the Fillmore, and I remember going in, and it was completely dark except for light projections that were on the back wall of the stage and, of course, the band. But when we went in there was no band playing yet. Now, the projections were made, they were made upstairs in the projection booth, and they were making them in those days on, what are those things in school, those overhead projectors that they were making them? They had these round disc-like, lens-like things, and they would use food coloring dye and stuff and colors, and they'd go like this, and the colors on the wall would it looked like giant amoebas or something. So I came in the dark, and there was that. It was an amazing scene. There were people everywhere in the dark, young people. There were two big speakers. That was the PA system in the Fillmore, and they were playing a recording of Ravi Shankar, the Indian maestro playing the sitar, an Indian raga, and people were just going like this, and everything. And there was this word back in those days that was going around, and that word was love. And everyone was talking about love. I didn't quite understand what they meant by that, You mean like really love, or you mean free sex, or what do you mean, And I remember there were bumper stickers that said, Jefferson Airplane loves you. And I felt that night when I went in there that I knew what that meant now, this word love. There was some kind of the situation was dripping with zeitgeist. Amazing. And there were people, and there was a very thick smell of patchouli, which I personally don't like, but at the time I had never smelled it before, and it smelled kind of, I thought, oh, maybe that's what marijuana smells like, So we're listening to Ravi Shankar on the speakers, and the first band to play that night at my first time at the Fillmore was Jefferson Airplane. I never heard them. I don't think I'd heard a Jefferson Airplane record. And they came on. There were three guys: Jorma Kaukonen on guitar, Jack Cassidy on bass, and Spencer Dryden on drums. And that later became their own group called Hot Tuna, I think. And they started playing a raga jam, like what they thought they had heard on the recording. And then after that was over, Jefferson Airplane proper came and they performed. And it was just mind-blowing. I mean, first of all, I had never heard anything that loud before. It was a time when volume in the music was becoming a dimension of the music. And it was loud and it was good. And you had all the other members of the band, Paul Kantner and Marty Ballin, and before Grace Slick was in that band, there was another woman named Signa Anderson, and she was the singer that night, I think, and I really liked her singing. So I was just really, it was a very strong experience for me. And they did their set, and when they were done, then they announced the next band. And the next band was the reason why my friend and I, we went to the Fillmore that night. Paul Butterfield Blues Band. So I'd heard the records, but I never heard them live. So they performed, and that was, Paul Butterfield on harmonica and vocals, and Mike Bloomfield on guitar. Big guitar hero at the time, before Eric Clapton, before we were aware of Eric Clapton in San Francisco. And Jack Cassidy and Spencer Dryden and, the Butterfield Blues Band. Jerome Arnold, Sam Lay on drums, Elvin Bishop, who's really, really well known now, and Mike Bloomfield. And talk about really good rock and blues, tight, up, really loud, really loud. I remember their first album. There's a little disclaimer on the back of the album, and it says, play this music, for best results, play this music as loud as possible. So I was listening to that, and obviously it was dripping with improvisation, you know, and interaction between the artists. It was wonderful. And I'd never seen such a good guitarist as Mike Bloomfield, and he was making a lot of faces, you know, and he was sort of mouthing the notes he played, and Butterfield's singing was wonderful, you know, and that made a really gigantic impression on me. So that was my first time to the Fillmore, and I went many, many more times over the next few years, and also to the Avalon Ballroom, which was across town, another rock ballroom. And I heard a lot of great artists. But that particular night, you know, and of course after that, I started modeling my bands on the Paul Butterfield Blues Band, and I was studying his harmonica solos. So anyway, that's a meaningful story for me. I hope you enjoyed it, and maybe I'll make some more of these videos, yeah?